Welcome everyone to the Sociology department. It is with great pleasure that we have organized this book launch today, one of our own. Lorenza Antonucci is an associate professor, has just joined our department this year and enriched it in so many ways already. Before that, she was in Birmingham. She had stints at Harvard and Sciences Po. And she has written a very important book dealing with a crucial issue we've all been scratching our heads about, but dealing with it in an original way as well. Populist voting and what's that all about have had many explanations, including the left behinds, the globalization, culture and nationalism. But I think what Lorenza does in this book in a very original way is use a framework that combines cultural and economic explanations to really study in a comparative way the microdynamics of everyday life of people who end up voting for populist movements. We're going to have Lorenza first presenting the books for around 30 to 35 minutes. That will be followed by our two discussants talking for a maximum of 10 minutes. For our first discussant, we have Margarita Jalipithy, who is an associate professor of public policy, and Dr. Ned Crowley, who is a fellow here in sociology, and Gonville and Keyes. Both of them are widely published in issues that have to do with public finance, welfare, economic precarity, and so on. So they'll talk about a maximum of 10 minutes each, and then Lorenza will get the right to respond before we open it up to our Q&A. Lorenza, please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for giving me this platform to talk about my book. I'm really excited to be here. In some ways, it's very serendipitous that I started to write this book in Cambridge, US, and I ended up in Cambridge, UK. And there are lots of coincidences in the book, as the book has been, and the research has started for me, that you will see during my presentation. This is a bit of a strange book. I want to be very upfront about this in the sense that it combines different disciplines in a time where I think in academia we are encouraged to be very specialized. So you get more in academia out of publishing in specialized article, being a specialist of a certain field. But for me, what I really wanted to do was to do the work that Lipset has done in the 50s, 60s, I think was more possible a few decades ago, of connecting the dots using what it's called in cognitive science a synthesizing mind for connecting different disciplines, which means also going into different literatures, spending more time. This book took me 10 years, so it's been 10 years since I published my last book, right? So it took me a lot of time to synthesize everything, and it took me a lot of time to even understand what I wanted to say. Yes, so let's start with a puzzle, which is really from another coincidence, which is the coincidence back in 2016, which is called the populist momentum. There are two places here, represented two places that are at the beginning of the book. If you read the intro, which is open access, you will find that I talk about two places that are on the seaside. One on the left has been called the sort of populist city, because it's a city where the populist party of the time in Italy always won. So 5 stars, then Lega, he went on one of the biggest magazines in Italy, and then now Meloni, who also gave a talk. And this place is called Montesilvano, which happens to be the place where I was born. And there is another place on the right, which is Hartlepool in the north of England, which is also a place very famous to be supporting, to have been supporting Brexit and the populist momentum in the UK, and he went in the New Yorker as the pro-Brexit coastal town. And it's a place where I used to pass every day when I was working at Teesside. So I had this coincidental situation that I was not expecting of spending a lot of time in two places that are characterized by two things, not just support for populism, but also insecurity. And I know this very well because one of the reasons why I moved to Teesside University was because it was famous for its research on precarity, the famous Teesside studies. And then I ended up, and I didn't plan it, to study populism, because in 2016 something happened, Brexit, which really changed my academic career. I wasn't planning to study populism. I have a background also in political science, but I wasn't planning to study the consequences of insecurity. At that point, I was just studying the causes and the dynamics of insecurity. And then this leads me to another coincidence, which is what happened today, what happened recently with the election in Gorton and Denton, which is important for two reasons. First, that the person who won this election in this place outside Manchester, you probably heard of, is someone from the Green Party who mentioned insecurity in her winning speech. She's really referring to a loss of a previous life that was previously secure, where you work hard, that you could get a nice house, even be able to go on holidays, and now you're not able to do this anymore. She's not talking just about deprivation, she's really talking about the loss of the lower middle class in the UK here. If you look at her speech, what's also important is that she's referring to what I will call later vertical oppositional scripts. So she's talking about the opposition between the people and the elites. And I will talk more about this. But the reason why this election was important is because one of the candidates was Matthew Goodwin, who is not just a reform candidate, so definitely populist right, but also, I wouldn't call him an ex-academic. He's an academic, still highly cited. He's one of the most cited scholars. And he was the person who really put forward this idea of the Brexit voters have the left behind, which was a total logical explanation for Brexit at that time, but not an accurate one. And it was not something that I think was aligning with how I was seeing the triggers of populism. And that's why I worked so hard to try to expand this reading of just the left behind supporting Brexit, because I really don't think that reflects what happened. So at that time, during 2016, what happened is that a lot of disciplines started to talk about the populist momentum. And so you see special issues coming up from all different fields: social policy, sociology, political science, economics. Everybody wanted to write about populism, not just political science. So sociology went back to use or to be interested in political concepts. Of course, this is not new. Lipset was a sociologist as well as a political scientist. But for many years, sociology was not writing about elections or about political outcomes. So it's quite interesting to see how sociology went back to that debate. At the same time, in political science, you see more work referring to class cleavages, sociological concepts, left behind, insecurity, precarity. And in economics, too, you see this argument of the globalization losers versus the globalization winners, which comes from the 2000s, really. And it was something that was kind of renewed for this new populist momentum. And the argument that Brexit vote and populism was strictly linked to austerity and also trade shocks, so this macro level, sort of macroeconomic triggers. But there were some explanations that were missing, and some open issues that still were open, they still stayed at that time. So the first one is that if you use the classic conceptualization of disadvantage as working class definition, etc., you were not able to explain the populist momentum. So the people who actually attempted to use those conceptualization could not show a link between being part of a lower socioeconomic class and supporting populism. And this was leading a lot of people to just remove material explanations behind populism, which was highly problematic, in favor of the culture. So in that time, you would hear things like, it's the culture stupid. It's not the economy, it's the culture. So that was a very popular trope. On the other side, all these macroeconomic explanations that came up, where scholars show a link between macroeconomic factors and populist support, were not explaining the micro-level dynamics. So if someone supports populism, just to give you a concrete example, is not because there have been trade shocks. What is the mechanism for which trade shocks enters into the lives of people and then the propensity to vote for populist parties? That was very clear. And also they were using a conceptualization of insecurity that was very limited, and I will talk about this. And then this debate between the economy and the culture was extremely dualized, and this was not just in political science, although it was very pushed by the cultural backlash theory, as you know, so Engelhardt and Norris. And it's important to stress that Engelhardt, is not just someone who looks at culture, but someone who theorized the turn to post-materialism. So one core element of his argument is that we live in a post-materialistic societies, right? So what I propose in this book is to sort of go beyond Lipset in the sense of trying to still use the economic, cultural, and political framework that I think was used 50, 60 years ago, but to think about the new politics of insecurity with a different use of this dimension. So my argument is that the new politics of insecurity is coming, yes, partially from socioeconomic factors. In particular, in the book, I talk about the desecuritization, the security shifts that have happened in European societies. So the fact that when we rely on the welfare mix, the family, state, and the market, this configuration of mixes has changed across time, for which we have to rely more and more on private sources, and the market has become more unstable, and that contributes to create insecurity. But it's also mediated by cultural factors, though not in the way that is talked about and addressed by the cultural backlash theory. So the cultural backlash theory looks at cultural factors as anti-migration attitudes, gender traditionalism, etc. What I do in the book is to look at broader scripts of cultural scripts and talk about the vertical and horizontal positional scripts overall. Okay, so not just looking at anti-migrations, or gender roles, or LGBTQI groups. These are important scripts, but they are not the only cultural scripts. And the third one is the political factors, because what has happened is also that parties addressing security was a very central point in their agendas, and mainstream parties have progressively moved away from providing security, and you have new actors coming up to provide responses to insecurity. So we need to understand new politics of insecurity at the intersection of these three dynamics. And then let's talk about how Europe became more insecure, which is fundamentally the first part. So for insecurity, this is a definition I use throughout the book. I refer to a widespread objective and subjective loss of financial and work-based security at the micro level, okay? So we can talk hours about the definition. I'm happy to talk about the Q&A, but fundamentally this is something that's really coming up from the insecurity studies literature. And what is interesting and special about this definition is that, first of all, it goes beyond this focus on job security and future, the loss of the future risk of losing your job, okay? Just to simplify. That is the most popular way of operationalizing insecurity in political science, so it goes beyond that. It focuses on individual experiences, but it has a connection with the macro level. That is probably the biggest difference with the risk literature, by the way. The risk literature was very much about risk as an external factor, while insecurity is very much about micro level experiences. And the other element is that compared to precarity, is less extreme, is more about ordinary insecurities that people experience, so not just extreme form of insecurity. Why? Because you need to use this concept to explain something else, which is populist support. So if you take an operationalization that is really, really limited, in my experience, you're not going to be able to explain populism, because populism is something that really is much more widespread than just 20 or 30% of the population. So the best way to probably talk about insecurity is just show the measures of what security is in work and finance. And you can have a closer look at this in the book. I don't want to talk too much about this, but I think the thing to notice here is that the previous research on insecurity was really looking at job and employment security. And while the measures that are used in the book have really expanded much more the way we conceptualize insecurity in relation to politics, but these are not items or dimensions I created. They were present already in the insecurity literature. They were just not linked to the populist and political literature, okay? And the other one is the items on financial insecurity that, again, you can find some of this. For example, in the ESS, you can find one item of deprivation. But what I think I've been trying to do for the past 10 years is really expanding the items that we use to understand financial insecurity to things that can be applicable to lower middle class people, such as inability to make savings, inability to cover unexpected expenses, ability to reduce debt. Financial anxiety is really important in financialization literature. So these are not items that, again, I created per se, but I selected things that were already present in the literature to understand populism, okay? So the first thing that I do in the first part of the book is describing how insecurity has increased. And I, of course, don't have a lot of time to do this now because I'm really interested in the discussion. But it's fundamentally a qualitative analysis of 9 cases that come from this security regimes, what I call security regimes. These are security regimes because they're not just ways in which the welfare state operates, but are also referring to ways in which the society mixes family, market, and state sources to provide security to individuals. And so what I argue is that basically there's been a desecuritization within each regime. So this is not limited to Europe if you look at the literature, but of course my analysis is limited to Europe in that those are the 9 cases I'm analyzing. Some of the security regimes have been objectively affected more than others, typically the Eastern, Southern security regimes, and in large part also the liberal security regimes. You have seen really transformative changes, especially in the UK, about the insecurity of the lower middle class. But if you look at the relative changes within each security regime, also the continental and Nordic countries have been highly affected. For continental Europe, I'm thinking about rise in work-based insecurity in France. And in Sweden, there is a really strong conversation about the loss of trygghet, which is a Swedish word to talk about the sense of security that is provided by the society. And that was also a core part of the social democratic foundation of the Swedish model. So there is a qualitative understanding in the book about how these security regimes have shifted. There's also a quantitative understanding of how these different indicators are showing that both work and financial insecurity are touching the majority of the population, not just the minority of the population. Just to give you an example, this is from the EWCS, which is the largest data set on work-based insecurity. And the traditional item, so the fear of losing your job, tends to attract in 2015 30% of the population agreeing with like this kind of form of insecurity. But there are other forms of insecurity, not being paid fairly, having bad career prospects, finding it hard to find a similar job to what I have now, that tends to attract even more support, and they're really touching close to this 50% of the population, or in this case of the working population. And in the book, I analyze different dimensions: autonomy, pressure, work pressure. But the one that I think comes up really strongly is work pressure, because the increase in work pressure is something that you see like in Europe from the 90s in particular, and it is probably related to the emphasis on the quantity of work over the creation of jobs that have quality jobs, basically. The other element that I look in the book is financial insecurity, looking at the ESS and EU Silk. With the EU Silk, there is one element that is quite interesting, is the use of this longitudinal data set that looks at how people that have experienced difficulties in making ends meet in the previous 4 years, if they have recovered or not. So it's a bit of a more dynamic understanding of insecurity. What I found interesting in this analysis is to show, of course, that there is a huge diversity across security regimes, but the impact on the lower middle, you can see in this dark gray, is quite powerful. It's really quite strong. And it shows that it's not, of course, the bottom that you would expect, but also the lower middle income group that is really affected by this dynamic presence of insecurity. And this is aligned with other studies that have analyzed something similar after, especially the 2008 crisis. How do we explain this shift on insecurity? There's a whole chapter that tries to do that, chapter 3. Basically, just to really summarize in a few words, it's really the reconfiguration of the welfare mix. So how the state, the family, and the market are operating to provide security. From the 90s, in 90s in particular, you see this shift to a new or transformed welfare state. Some people call it a social investment welfare state. People like Sociology and Iverson in Democracy and Propensity argued that this transformed welfare state was able to retain work and was fundamentally able to protect European societies. And basically my point is, yes, if you look only at the creation of jobs, yes, but there is an unexpected effect on the society in having people, in basically operationalizing a sort of conceptualizing welfare state intervention as something that is individualistic. You know, it's focused on the individual, pushing people in the labor market, so the focus on activation or in work or sort of like quantity of jobs basically went at the detriment of the quality of jobs. On the other side, you see this relationship between the market and family really changing. So because you're focusing on individuals, so letting people invest in their education and therefore having to ask their families to contribute, the family also becomes also a trigger of reproduction of inequality. And on the other side, you see the state becoming more conditional, more targeted, and therefore focusing on the most extreme forms of precarity or insecurity, but not on the forms of insecurity and precarity that are experienced in people in work. So there is really this gap that is coming up from how the welfare states operates that I describe in chapter 3. The second part of the book is about showing the links between insecurity and populist support, right? And this is where I talk more explicitly about also the cultural frames. So how do we understand populism? There are two kind of broad different ways to simplify it. One is to just look at the people who vote for populist left and right. And the other one, which I use in the book, is to rely on the ideational definition of populism, which looks at fundamentally two items. So if people believe in the centrality of the people in politics, and if there is this belief in the opposition between the people and the elites. There is a third item, there's Manichaean outlook, but it's like a consequential one. And this additional definition of populism is useful because if you're not presented with populist left or populist right options in your country, how do you express populism if not through your opinions, not just through voting? So it really allows you to understand populism beyond the supply of populist parties, okay? So these are just, again, showing, I think, the items are the best way to really explain how different it is. Of course, the disagreement is shifted, it's not always the same, but basically these are questions that look at if politicians should always listen closely to the problems of the people, the will of the people should be the highest principle in this country's politics, or people-centrism. Anti-elitism is things like quite a few of the people running the government are crooks, so a negative view of the elites. What is quite interesting about these items is that if you look at them, you might notice that you probably agree with some of this, and that is the point. So sometimes I have discussion with political scientists tell me, oh, but these items cannot be right, because I agree with some of them. But that's exactly the point. Populist outlook is actually, if you use fuzzy understanding, diffuse among the population, and it's not black and white. It's not like you're populist or not. These are also attitudes that tend to change quite a bit across time. The Manichaean outlook is the black and white vision of society is quite derivative from the other two. So these are really the two components. So in the book, there's obviously a much more complex version of this framework. But basically, what this framework is telling you, and the way I explain the link between insecurity and populist right and left, is that the insecurity, financial work insecurity I discussed, is mediated by the vertical and oppositional scripts, which push people into populist right, but also populist left when they have this option, depending on which cultural script, if it's vertical or horizontal. I will explain what I mean for that, but it can also pull away people from mainstream politics, which is the other side of the coin, and also pull people away from politics at all. There's now a lot about non-voting, and you can see, like, even the last election in the UK, the percentage of non-voters was quite high. So alongside an attention to populist voting, we also need to really talk more about non-voting and people moving from and in out of non-voting. But what I mean for oppositional scripts, like summarizing like 30, 40 years of research, is basically I try to establish a connection between this understanding of populism, so the people versus the elites, and what is present in the in-out group literature, the recognition literature, the literature on cultural boundaries, okay? So the opposition between us, the people, and the elites is a clear example of a vertical script, you know? Vertical because it's against people who are higher in the social hierarchy, okay? But there's also really important horizontal opposition present between those who are recognized to be part of the people and are worthy of our solidarity and those who are basically excluded from our lines of solidarity. Why? Because they lack kind of features of worth based on race, ethnicity, LGBTQI characteristics, but also important because they lack worth based on the fact that they're not productive in society. That is a really important cultural script that is never discussed, I think, or hardly discussed in the political science field, although there are some really interesting studies that have come up recently, but it's very present in the sociological field with the studies on meritocracy. So basically, this idea that merit is really what makes people part of a certain society also influences the cultural scripts that people are presented with and the choices they made when they are subjected to this cultural scripts. So not all of the people are included in this idea of the people versus the elites, okay? And then moving to what parties are offering in terms of like cultural scripts. If you look at mainstream parties, a lot of mainstream parties went into horizontal oppositional scripts, actually, and they abandoned the idea of providing security as a political offer. Why? Because they move into more individualistic framings, and actually active labor market policy are actually quite based on this individualistic idea of merit, of being productive in the society, of pushing it. So the political consequences of focusing on these individualistic scripts are really present, I think, in politics right now. Populist parties are often discussed to have a pars destruens, I call it, so an oppositional like way of doing politics. That is true. Like the populist right parties are definitely oppositional. Horizontal oppositional scripts are really dominant for populist right party. Populist left parties use more vertical oppositional lines. But they also, I think both parties are also providing a solution. So often populist right parties refer to the role of the state in a welfare chauvinistic way, or to the role of the family as a provider of security. Why? Because we have completely abandoned this idea that family could be actually a provider of security, even though this is what happens in reality. The policies are based on a very individualistic way of understanding society. And therefore, there is really a gap that they responded. And populist left parties, they put an emphasis on the role of the state. I want to say the populist right parties also put an emphasis on the role of the market, most like in some places. If you look at them in the Netherlands, they really rely on this idea of the market provides security. In the book, I discussed the manifesto dataset, which is an interesting, it's an interesting dataset, but also has some limitations because it only looks at saliency. But what I wanted to show you here is that in Spain, for example, Podemos being more on the pro-security agenda than PSOE, although Vox was really high on the pro-commodifications or pro-market. Vox is clearly a party that is really presenting a lot of market-based solutions to insecurity. And in Sweden, though, you see this populist right party, the Swedish Democrats, that are much lower than the Social Democrats and the populist, the mainstream right, on commodification, which is, I think, quite interesting to understand why they gain support, and the populist left, which is much less, actually, has gained much less votes, also being very pro-security compared to the Social Democrats. So you can see that the mainstream parties, which are here, have really left a gap for political agendas that are low on commodification and are high on security, which these parties have captured. And the link between insecurity and populism, that is, of course, one of the core chapters of the book, but I think it's something that we'd already published, so we were sort of getting there publishing for journal articles. So the book is really a summary of the findings. So I won't repeat too much of what's already there, but fundamentally we did show a link between financial insecurity and populist outlook, and also between work-based insecurity and populist outlook in all the cases that were studied. There were a few exceptions between financial insecurity and populist support, but specifically populist right support in a few countries, in Eastern Europe and Italy. And that was explained by the fact that populist right parties in Eastern Europe and in Italy have been in power recently. And also you have some quite interesting shifts. But what is added in the book that I think is quite interesting is the relationship between insecurity and gender. So we conducted one study linking basically two different data sets where we show that for men, it was really very much work-based insecurity that was associated with populist right voting in particular. Particularly work pressure and job dissatisfaction. And for women, it was very much financial insecurity that was associated with total populist voting. And that could be explained really by the way insecurity enters into gender relations. And for women, it could be actually more through the managing of financial resources, that for men would be more through social status and work. And the other interesting sort of brick that it's added into this discussion is the dynamic relationship between insecurity and non-voting. And this was done through a study before and after the pandemic, looking at financial and work insecurity. And what was interesting here was that the increase of insecurity, support for populism and non-voting both increased. But if we focus on the people who were voting for populist parties before the pandemic, at the increase of insecurity, they were more likely to actually not be non-voters and vice versa. So what you see is almost like a yo-yo effect between non-voting and populist support at the increase of insecurity, which I think can be explained by the fact that people are not really happy about either choice and they just move between these two kind of states, not finding that any state is really satisfactory to what they would like to see. I don't know how much time I have. No. But just to conclude, I think there is also like an important chapter about the solutions that fundamentally, it's really not just, it's looking at the cultural scripts, so changing the cultural scripts on how the role of the market, the state, and the family can provide security, and also changing the policies. So I won't talk about this because I prefer to have a discussion. And just to say, there's going to be more talks coming up. And this one you can actually follow online because it's in Cambridge, US, although the time zone might not allow for audience to stay until late, okay? Thank you.
Would you like me sat or standing?
I think we can all see it. I think we should all see it. Yeah.
I need it.
Maybe. Oh, yeah. Ned. Yeah. And that's what you know where it's in.
Do I need to wear it?
Yeah. Who wants to start? You want?
I'll start. Yeah.
No, the microphone is actually there on the table. So you don't have to wear a microphone. It's on the table.
Right, okay, great. So we have, yeah. So, I'm really happy to be here today, and it was really a pleasure to read this book. It was really a pleasure to have this opportunity, this excuse to sit down and read a book from start to finish for a purpose. So thank you very much. It's a fabulous book, and I really encourage you all to read it. So understanding populism has, I think, a claim to be one of the most pressing issues of our time. But it's hard to say new things about it. It's hard to go beyond the banal. It's hard to feel like we're adding anything to what Polanyi and Lipset had said, right? So this is no small achievement that this book manages to say new things, firstly, and more importantly, perhaps, it manages to open up the debate rather than shut it down. It encourages us and it allows us to have our own thoughts, where there's been a bit of a dampening effect often on the topic. So it's very readable as a book, a pleasure to read. It's empirically very rich, but also theoretically rich. And it really manages to speak to both political scientists and sociologists. There's something in here if you're a quant, if you're a qual, if you're neither and you're a member of the public. This is really a book that will appeal to many. And at some point in the book, Lorenza writes that the book adds another brick in the construction of our understanding of contemporary populism. I think this is too modest. In setting out its argument, the book needs to make use of several bricks. And so there are several empirical pieces to the puzzle that the book contributes, and several theoretical moves that need to be made in order to make this interesting argument. So, of course, it's going to take 10 years. I'm going to draw attention to the two contributions that I think would stand out most to a political scientist, as I'm coming from a political science perspective. The first is the emphasis that this book places, the argument that it's the ordinary and everyday experiences of financial insecurity and insecurity in work, in people's work conditions, that contribute to populism. And I can't overestimate the novelty of really kind of internalizing this argument from the perspective of political science. So it's not unemployment. It's not the risk of unemployment or the threat of unemployment. It's not labour market outsiderness or the threat of being a labour market outsider. These are concepts that are loved by political economists. But it's not these. It's not the left behind working class that face mass unemployment as a result of deindustrialization or globalization or automation or whatever it may be. It's the insecure insiders. Okay? It's the squeezed middle. It's the squeezed middle whose relative standing in society is perhaps declining, who feel unfairly paid, unhappy in their jobs, but fear that their current job is the best they're going to get. So these insecure insiders, this squeezed middle, it's given up on the mainstream political parties. It's given up on the social investment agenda. This is how the argument evolves. They have turned to populist parties. Now, why have they turned to populist parties? The book really nicely sets out how it's the mainstream parties that got them into this mess by retrenching welfare states, by shifting risks from the state and employers to individuals, so this great risk shift that has been set out in the political science literature, the great risk shift in the name of social investment. So in this context, populist parties offer different solutions. They offer policy solutions for the insecurity faced by the insiders, the squeezed middle. And the book, frankly, it could have stopped there, because drawing attention to this is no small thing. It involves combining a story of policy demand for policies to address insecurity, with a story of policy supply. What policy solutions are supplied by political parties. But the book goes further, and it goes further to ask, why has right-wing populism been more successful than left-wing populism often? Why do we see the right-wing populist policy solutions somehow convincing people more than the left populist solutions that seek to unite the insecure people against the elites? What's going on there? And here there's another really, I think, important brick that is being placed in our understanding. So the book brings in the role of ideas. The dominant employment-centered paradigm, Lorenza calls it the productivist paradigm, that underpins the social investment approach. When we combine this with internalized beliefs in and ideas about meritocracy, the value of meritocracy, the existence of meritocracy, we get a kind of a set of causal beliefs and ideas about the world that sit very uneasily with welfare universalism. They undermine support for the narratives and the policy solutions of the populist left, but they are compatible with the oppositional frames of the populist right. I found this really, really interesting, and I'm really hoping that Lorenza might say a little bit more about this very novel argument. Perhaps more importantly than these two specific contributions, I think the book opens up, it raises some interesting questions, and I'm going to talk about two of them. First, having established that the insecure lives of insiders in particular lead to populist support, do we know what happens when this insecurity is reduced? So when the insecurity faced by insiders is reduced, does populism fade or does it stay? If social democratic parties were to manage to build up the welfare state, perhaps through more generous universal policies, perhaps through regional or place-based policies, industrial policies, who knows, would support for populist parties and policies decline? Is insecurity like yeast, where you take away the yeast and you take away the fuel for populism? Or does it allow populist narratives, populist frames to spread, and then these take on a life of their own, like a ratchet effect? I'd like to hear a little bit about what Lorenza thinks about this, but this is a question that this book left me with. And finally, how does education structure insecurity politics? I think this is really a fundamental question for our time. The book talks about education in a very interesting way. It adds some nuance to our understanding of how education reduces insecurity and thereby reduces support for populism. So we kind of know, this is quite well established, that education, to the extent that it reduces economic insecurity, it can reduce support for populist ideas, support for populist parties. Now, the book shows, interestingly, that those with intermediate levels of education, not just low levels of education, but also intermediate levels of education, also increasingly are experiencing insecurity. And this has consequences for populist attitudes, populist voting. But education, of course, or we'd like to hope, we believe, I think, plays a role beyond its effect on economic security. It affects and shapes people's ideas. Many mechanisms for this beyond the economic, right? Intergroup contact, increasing analytical ability, liberal instruction, perhaps. There are several mechanisms. So beyond its effects on economic prospects, there is evidence that education still matters, and beyond its economic effects, it reduces authoritarian values, reduces nationalism. nationalist attitudes. We've known this for a while, but we've also known that, and here the evidence is sort of mounting, that education also instills meritocratic ideas. Okay, and these are the very ideas that Lorenza talks about in her book as perhaps eroding support for redistribution, for more universal kind of welfare attitudes. We might say that education fosters inclusion without solidarity. So how do these ideational effects relate to populist support? I think by highlighting the importance of meritocratic values for understanding the form that populism takes, whether right or left, the book is perhaps suggesting that we might need to rethink how education structures populism, without of course, addressing the question, which would be a whole new book. So thank you very much.
Sure. Okay. So there'll be some overlap, but I'll try and not reproduce too much of what Marguerite said. So first of all, thanks very much, Lorenza, for the invitation to read the book. I have read some of your articles, although there's too many to read, even a fraction of them, I think. So I thought I had a kind of a good sense of what the book was going to look like before I started reading it, and I was proved wrong throughout. I was consistently surprised as I read through the chapters just how comprehensive the argument and the evidence and theoretical contributions are here. And so this brief synopsis of the book really can't do it justice. And in the presentation, you get the sense it's a piece of socioeconomics and political science or sociology, but it's also a really original study on political culture, work, the family, social reproduction, and the transformation of European society over the last 30 years. So there's something in it that will interest everybody in this room and beyond. So I'm going to start by emphasizing just a couple of contributions to the book that I thought were important that maybe didn't come out strongly enough in the presentation, and then I'll raise just 2 questions, 2.5 questions. But before getting into the book, it's worth pointing out that Lorenza is also a pivotal member of this emerging field of insecurity studies, including through the research network in insecurity with the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics, and I expect this book will be a major hit this summer at Bordeaux. So I'm glad I got to read it early. But I bring this up because I think practically every student I teach or supervise is interested in at least one dimension of the Insecurity Studies project. And I think it's a good, not to tell you all to flock to Lorenza, but I think it's a good model if you're sort of an emerging scholar to attach yourself to these research networks, these international research networks, because it can be a good place to workshop work, engage with other kind of scholars. And so if you're interested in these topics, I'd look into the SASE, the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics, and Lorenza's research network in particular. Okay, so to begin with, as Lorenza has explained and Marguerite has summarized a little bit, the book theorizes and empirically shows the micro-sociological mechanisms that drive macroeconomic, macro-level correlations between, on the one hand, labor market and welfare state transformations, and on the other hand, populist support and outlook. And in this sense, it's sort of essentially doing the classic Coleman's boat thing, right? It's sort of building out the lower decks of micro-action that produce macro-sociological effects. But what's offered in the book is much more than simply estimating the effect of some individual level X variables on Y variables embedded in some multi-level structure. Instead, Lorenza develops a comprehensive and explanatory theoretical model linking socioeconomic, cultural, and political factors, including, just to name a few, transformations of the labor market and work, the welfare state, the family, recognition gaps, status decline, and the realignment of historical party cleavages and the supply side of new political scripts. And I just want to pick up on one major contribution here because it connects directly to my interest in the welfare state and the transformation of the welfare state. In chapter 3, Lorenza gives what I think is one of the clearest accounts of the transformation of the welfare state since the end of the 20th century that I've read. And does something that most sociologists don't do, which is engage both with the critical political economy literature and the social policy analysis literature. So I'll summarize just briefly, because Margarita also hit on this, but since the 1990s, the welfare state has abandoned the ambition of shaping demand through state intervention and guaranteed income support, and instead, I'm paraphrasing here, pursue the ambition of influencing the supply of work through active labor market policies and social investment. And in this regime, the individualization of security and the normalization of insecurity has been progressively embedded within welfare state interventions. And here Lorenza introduces the instructive example of Wolfgang Strick, one of the few sociologists who can truly be said to have a significant impact on public policy, for better or for worse. And in the interest of time, and because this is being recorded, I won't go into the whole story of Strick, but it's interesting to observe that Strick had in the 1990s advised the German Social Democratic Party on active labor market policy, and today is an active supporter and advisor for the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, which is a kind of syncretic left conservative populist party that's doing quite well in state elections in Eastern Germany. And I take this as kind of allegory in one person for the center-left reaping today what it sowed 30 years ago. So the contribution here, as I see it, is that there's a huge amount of writing on how the welfare state has evolved under what we might simplify as neoliberalism, although I don't think Lorenza wants to use that term exactly. However, sociologists have written a lot less about the long-term effects of welfare state transformations on people's well-being and life outcomes in both material and psychosocial terms. And to explore this, Lorenza engages with the social policy scholarship to show how changes since the 1990s, and then again after the financial crisis, have made us materially and emotionally and affectively less secure. The second big contribution I want to highlight is that part of Lorenza's argument, I think one of the most interesting parts of the argument, is that insecurity is simultaneously a potential source of common identity or even solidarity, and of division and animosity, particularly between insecure people, in scare quotes, and secure elite, or between insecure deserving members of the nation and some undeserving outsiders. So insecurity creates new political coalitions that cut across class and transform the social bases of political parties. And in chapter 6, Lorenza addresses why populism has taken the form of horizontal oppositional discourses as opposed to more horizontal solidarity scripts, asking, in quotes, why is it so difficult to translate shared experiences of insecurity into solidaristic forms of politics? And this question really is one of the most important questions for the study of politics, from 18th Brumaire through Lipset to what's the matter with Kansas. So I'm going to come back to it in my questions. Okay. So just 2.5 questions. So the first one is about the role of place in the geography of insecurity, because you open and end the book, and it comes up in the presentation too, the examples of Hartlepool and Montesilvano, which come to represent or have come to represent hotbeds of populist support. And we might think of these as the quintessential left behind places where insecurity is spatially concentrated both materially and subjectively. And we know from the political science and political sociology on place in politics, including Catherine Kramer's work on the politics of resentment, that places are a place of political identity formation, as well as places where material interests and experiences are concentrated. So for example, in Kramer's work on the politics of resentment in the US, rural and suburban residents resent city dwellers because cities are hubs of economic activity, political power, and cultural capital. And we can think of all sorts of other geographic cleavages. North of England resents the South, former East Germany resents the West, provincial France has always resented Paris since the First Republic, and I understand that each half of Italy resents the other half. So how does place matter here, both in the subjective and maybe sociotropic evaluation of insecurity, and also the conversion of insecurity into populist support? And this is an invitation to give not just a spatial, but also a relational analysis, because people interact in space. They communicate through the two-step flow of information through networks, and they form identities that are attached to place, and so on. Okay. All right, so yeah, on the right versus left populism question, which is, I think, one of the most important questions, and then the role of anti-immigrant politics here. So as you point out in the book, left populism has not enjoyed nearly the same success as right populism, especially since a lot of the analyses that make up the empirical portions are from, let's say, 2015 to 2019. So as far as I know, there are no left populist parties and governing coalitions in Europe. Podemos and Syriza have all but collapsed. Five Star Movement, if it really, I mean, whether you can call that left or not it's doubtful, but anyway, it sort of rapidly peaked and declined after 2018. The Dutch Socialist Party has 3 seats. Die Linke will never poll above 10% in Germany. And the strongest party is perhaps La France Insoumise, but they are still well behind the National Rally. So Margarita picked this up as well. Left populism really isn't the same political force as right populism in Europe. And you give an explanation in the book, which is that right populists' advantage lies in their capacity to emphasize these horizontal divisions based on race, ethnicities, and evaluations of worth and deservingness. And secondarily, that these horizontal oppositional scripts resonate more with voters in comparison to the past because of productivism and meritocracy have become dominant cultural frames. And this is also consistent with Hochschild's argument, essentially, that right populist voters in Louisiana aren't racist, they just don't like the idea of blacks and Latinos cutting in line for the supposedly meritocratic American dream. So I think this is one of the most important claims of the book, and I find it basically persuasive, but I want to probe it a little bit further and ask 2 questions. One is a counterfactual kind of question, the other is more interpretive. So the counterfactual question goes like this. Say European societies had not gotten more heterogeneous ethnically or racially over the last generation, and that there was no racialized, undeserving other for right populist parties to blame. In that scenario, would we expect to see a rise in left-wing populism in response to the same causes of insecurity that you describe in the book? I know you addressed this in your recent piece for Project Syndicate, but it's paywalled, so I haven't read it. So maybe you could talk about it here.
Oh, it's behind paywall in Korean Times. I'll link.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah. And then this on the interpretive question. So I'm thinking a lot about this difference between first-person and third-person accounts because we're reading about this in a different reading group. So on interpreting the first-person accounts of populist supporters, which of course you can't do everything in this book. So if you polled populist supporters on what is the most important problem facing the country today, which is sort of classic measure of issue salience, the most common answer would probably be immigration, I'd venture to say. And if you asked in an interview with populist supporters why immigration is a problem, they might answer crime, the threat of terrorism, incompatible cultural and religious values, the fiscal burden on taxpayers, and work and financial insecurity might be somewhere lower down on the list. So how do we as sociologists close the gulf between what populist supporters tell us in their own words and our sociological, our third-person explanations for their actions? You make an argument in the book, and you cite Bart Bonakowski, for example, to show that socioeconomic insecurity increases the salience of majority group identities, and this makes the insecure more receptive to out-group animosity. But I wonder if you could just walk us through the logic in more depth here. Thanks, Lorenza.
We don't have a ton of time, but do you want to give a quick response, maybe focus on the left-right one, and then maybe we'll have an expansive discussion with the discussants later on.
I mean, you made so many nice, interesting points that are making my brain go. Yes, okay, on the left and right. I think one thing I want to say is that even though the populist left is not in power, it has changed a lot European politics. You know that in the Netherlands, the Social Democrats are merging with the Green Party, which has clear populist left characteristics. I think that's unprecedented. The way the Socialist Party went in on an election with the populist left in France, that's the reason why they came second, right? It's also quite like this is something that you would have not predicted. When they told me that the Green Party was merging with the Social Democrats in the Netherlands, I was shocked. This was not. And I spoke with someone who's dealing with this, and she also told me that 1 year ago this was not even possible. So the way the populist left is transforming this center left is still a signifier of this kind of importance of looking, I would say, at both sides. But I'm really also interested in this third person explanation you're saying. I have friends who work in polls, in the polls business, and they tell me that the cost of living crisis, it's coming really as one of the strongest motivations of political dissatisfaction at the moment. I know that migration is obviously there, and it is, you're right, that this is something that, because we're saying that they have a cultural script, we inevitably have to go behind of sort of how people express it and how people are subjected to the cultural script without being paternalistic and patronizing, but how we we read this, but I think in sociology and in social science in general, you need to sort of go beyond the sort of first argument and the way we shape the questions, sometimes in the polls, also driving the answers, and often in the polls, these questions are shaped in a very narrow way, and therefore I noticed that when I was testing these questions on insecurity, things come up a lot more when you like open up questions. So I think it's a lot to do with how we measure as well what people think. And we just want to say to Margherita's points that are really also interesting. The point about education, I'm still thinking about, because I think education has this double function on, obviously potentially changing the scripts, but with the highly marketized education that we have right now, we also see that students might be more prone to have more meritocratic approaches, as you said. I think we don't see much the effect on education right now because we have a population which the levels of education is still different. And I want to say that in the younger generation, having education has a completely different meaning than for the older generation, particularly in terms of if you don't have it, you cannot access the labor market at all. If you don't have sort of university education, you're really cut off from accessing the labor market. And I think because of that, it has some really stricter links with insecurity, I want to say, that for other generations. But I don't know if that answers, but I think it's something that we still need to understand more about the relation between insecurity and education and the sort of different effects it can have on populist outlook.
Okay, great. Over the top, Alex, yeah?
Really fascinating talk and great research, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book. I'm sure it's going to be a great read. My question is really just if you could say a bit more about the kind of theoretical importance of insecurity to your framework, because some of the ways in which you're understanding insecurity we'd normally think about in terms of job quality or working conditions, so like autonomy, work intensity, work-life balance, for example. And so you could write an alternative story, which would be more of a classic Marxist account that there's degradation at work taking place, and that's leading to class politics and a return to class politics, as opposed to insecurity being driven by insecurity and leading to insecurity politics.
Should I answer? Yeah, I don't think my argument is against that. In fact, I use a lot of Polanyi in my work. But I think the difference with your perspective is that I talk about the reconfiguration of class cleavages in a dynamic way. The problem right now is that, so insecurity has a more dynamic effect on class cleavages. So we're not in a situation where we have a new class formation that we can explore. So therefore we can say there is a precariat that is, voting for populists, like, as say Guy Standing would say. So this is why I find more useful to talk about insecurity, because it basically studies the dynamic behind this sort of reproduction at work, but also beyond work, because I look at financial insecurity, so I want to go beyond work a little bit as well. And actually I find that mostly it's financial insecurity that it's even stronger than work-based insecurity, because both work-based insecurity is really important. So I want that to be, maybe in 20 years, in 30 years, we will see a clear class reconfiguration. We will be able to sort of reproduce, almost like create a new Marxist analysis of this. But for now, I think the problem is that using only a Marxist analysis, I want to say, it excludes all the cultural scripts explanation that are really important to understand the direction of this resentment. But yeah, I think I get some from it, but something to overcome as well. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's obviously an excellent paper in terms of the predisposing factors towards political change. But I wonder if you're trying to explain the political choice, political choice between left and right, don't you have to look at the other side of this, another dimension? Look at the leadership, for instance, the nature of the charisma of the leaders. People like Corbyn, for instance, Trump, Farage, they've all got particular personality characteristics, and maybe there's a possibility, maybe there's some inadequacy in the leadership of left-wing parties, which may be partly due to the kind of people who are leaders, let alone the policies of those political leaders. But I mean, how much would you importance would you give to the nature of leadership in explaining the development of the political groups that are challenging the existing order?
Yeah, so I look at in chapter 4 actually at what the parties do. I don't look specifically at leadership because I think for me it's more important to look at the agendas that parties propose. Although there are people who, I think we did try years ago to look at something, if insecurity was associated with perceptional leadership, and I didn't find anything interesting about that specifically. But there are people who look specifically at like the style, of the party. I want to say that in terms of leadership, also populist left, like as you say, Corbyn and Mélenchon have a really strong leadership. So I think I wouldn't say it's something that is just from the populist right. But for me, it's important to look at what the parties are presenting as well. That it's touching people's lives beyond only the leadership style.
Maria?
Yeah, thanks for that, Lorenza. My question, I suppose, is about the sort of mechanism by which insecurity is related to voter choice. And so it's absolutely clear that we have, by any kind of objective measure, we have seen a sort of secular increase in all types of insecurity across loads of countries. But I'm wondering about the extent to which the response to this relates to people, whether it's a sort of absolute thing. So whether there's something that you can sort of characterize as a sort of absolute level of insecurity and people are reacting to that, or are they reacting? So are they reacting to their own position? Are they reacting to their own position relative to other people that they see? Or are they kind of reacting to the position of people who are a bit like them and who they might become?
Yeah, that's an important question. You asked me something similar in the job interview. I don't know if you remember. I remember. It was more about generations. Yeah, I think that is really important. It touches on social status, which I really didn't have time to talk about today, but it's really closely related to insecurity. And we have this really interesting paper that looks at, actually use structural equation modeling to talk about to investigate the functional and the effect of social status and insecurity on populist outlook. And social status is asking people how they place themselves in this ladder in relation to others. And obviously when they say relation to others, they're going to answer about the people that they have around. They're not going to think about the remote elites that they don't know. And I think it's a dynamic concept that has to do with the loss of something that was secure before. So I'm not sure I was really able to convey this in my presentation, but it's something that has to do with the state of security in Europe after the Second World War and how that has been historically lost over time. And therefore, it's something that has to do with the past, and it's something that has to do with the others in relation to social status. So it's both, that's why I say it's objective and subjective at the same time. And I don't actually like the division between objective and subjective, because I feel like when economists do that, they usually mean to say we only have to look at numbers, because that's objective. And if we ask people questions, that's subjective, and therefore that's going to be relative. And that is really problematic, I think. Yeah.
So we have Robert first, and then Alan.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the fascinating book. I read the first chapter this morning, but then I hit the paywall.
Oh, yeah.
So I will have to get it in print now.
Yeah.
So I really like how you bring together work insecurity and financial insecurity. Regarding financial insecurity, so a lot of scholars of class and others, economic sociologists, they're talking about a class divide between those who own property and those who are renting. Is that something that you find with regard to support for populist parties? Is there such a cleavage increasingly?
This is something that I'm really interested in exploring, but it's been really hard because people don't like to answer questions about wealth in general, and it's something that we tried to do before, and people don't want to share. But I think that there are actually scholars. I'm thinking about Paulina Patana in Georgetown, who is actually going to be my discussant. She does really interesting research on housing and populist, both qualitative. She did an ethnographic study in Finland and the US, and quantitative. And she actually shows that house-related insecurity in a very similar way than I explore insecurity, but just for the house part is really important. Even like things like being able to repay your the goods in your house, it's one of the others that we explore. And therefore having these items on housing that she explored mostly in an ethnographic way, because the surveys don't have enough questions on housing, shows that there are actually really strong overlaps, yes.
Yeah, thank you. That was so interesting and thought-provoking. And I have a question which is coming from, in a way, media and comm studies, where there's this idea. Okay, first, I get the sense that in this, there's an assumption that the state wants to position, or the parties want to position themselves as a solution to insecurity in a way, right? And so I'm thinking about informational insecurity and the way that, Putin's Russia or Trump's America actually creates informational insecurity as a way to disengage people politically because they're so busy trying to figure out what is true, what is not true, right? So it's a way to disengage publics. And I think you were asking about this as well, but I'm wondering if there's like this sort of insecurity populism parabola, that as insecurity goes up, people go more and more towards populism, and then as insecurity goes up further, they actually disengage politically completely because they're so busy trying to find their next source of income or whatever. And so if in a way states, and I'm thinking about the war on Iran and about what exactly the Trump government's doing, and if you destabilize a population economically, you might disengage them politically as well as you move towards authoritarian populism.
Yeah, these are really interesting overlaps. It makes me think about two things. I'm not super familiar with the informational insecurity concept, that is quite interesting. But I think one thing that you're mentioning and touching upon is how also insecurity has been sort of deprived of these socioeconomic features. So this physical notion of security from September 11 has become predominant. So what I try to do in the book is also like bringing attention to how security has to do more with also with socioeconomic aspects of people's lives, not just with threat. But now that we're going back to this kind of physical threat situation, I think it's going to be quite interesting to see whether socioeconomic insecurity is also going to be so high in the agenda, because physical security is so much more dominant now.
Questions? Zaina? Yeah?
Thank you. It's really interesting. I was wondering to what extent you think there is a relationship between scapegoating and success, like the success of populist parties in creating the illusion of an answer to people's financial insecurity. Because it seems to me, I was just thinking about much of the global south has been in this state of financial insecurity for decades now, since the 90s, at least, in terms of precarity and stuff. And when there is a scapegoat, it becomes, populations become ideologized against that, which may be what we're seeing in Europe now. And when there isn't one, there's a revolution, as we saw in many of the Arab Spring, Arab revolutions. People start putting themselves on fire because they can't find jobs, and millions empathize with that or relate to it, and therefore they join these movements. So to what extent do you think the success of a state of finding a scapegoat, including the right-wing populist parties that you talked about, which scapegoat immigrants generally, is kind of, is a condition for populist parties to be able to present themselves as offering solutions to this financial insecurity?
Yeah, so the horizontal oppositional script is exactly scapegoating. Like it's almost like a theorization of what is scapegoating, because it's basically telling that not everybody is part of this solidaristic notion of the people, but it's also saying that the problem comes from the others who are not included in this collective notion of the people. I would say, even though this is focusing on Europe for this book, there are studies from Latin America, where, by the way, the definition of populist comes from, that also shows, for example, quite interestingly, because Latin America goes from, as we have seen in Brazil, from populist right, but there was populist left to populist right to populist left again, that this kind of cultural scripts can also be changed, depending on, of course, if the leader is focusing on scapegoating or finding collective solutions to address this sort of common insecurity.
Yeah,
question. I really enjoyed the presentation. I cannot wait to read the book. It's about gender and your slide on gender. Yeah. And it was such an interesting slide. And I wondered if there's also production of insecurity along gendered lines. You know, when I'm thinking of the reform and the riots, the hotel riots and things, this idea of the dangerous migrant man and the protection of the pure woman or our girls and our children. And I wonder if there was a gender aspect to insecurity and how that is produced too, that you've thought about or come across in your research.
Yeah, definitely there is. We have this special issue in the British Journal of Sociology on insecurity. There are actually 3-4 contributions that really tackle this point of gender and insecurity. How insecurity is gendered, and I think we don't know enough about how insecurity is gendered because we're not looking enough at the subjective measures, or we haven't done that enough. But I think for this, in this case, I could only split and look at genders and to explain populism. But in general, I do think that the notion of insecurity is highly gendered. Even putting financial insecurity in gives you, basically makes you see women's experience of insecurity in a way that if you only focus on work insecurity is not coming up, I think. And for me that is quite important.
Can I jump in on this just to highlight something in your book that you haven't just said there, but it's really interesting. It's about how right-wing populist parties think of the nexus of market, state, and family as providing security, and what's happened since the last 30, 40 years is that all three of these institutions no longer provide security in the same way they did. And so the right-wing populist parties are making solutions along all three of those axes. And when it comes to the family, it's traditional gender roles, it's preserving family values, it's femo-nationalism, right? Challenging anything that is a kind of foreign threat to the family structure that we have here in Britain or Germany or France or whatever the case may be. So you can see the gender politics of the right-wing populist parties showing up as well.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. Yeah, so this is quite important because what I'm saying is the mainstream parties are not talking about like if people live in a family. Of course, we don't have to go to the traditional role of the family, but talking to people like if they are atoms and just individuals is also a problem. And they are definitely, covering this gap that is in politics with their traditional offer of a response to insecurity. But there could be a more progressive offer to address insecurity that takes into account an enlarged vision of the family, or what families are right now, for example.
Yes, so maybe just building up on the question about gender. So it's quite clear how the experiences of insecurity are gendered. But how about like the political responses of people? Are those also gendered? Because there are some data out there, right? Like that men tend to vote much more to the right populist than the women. It depends on the society. But is that something that you found? And
yeah, that was the background of that article that was presented. By the way, you can see as a working paper in Harvard, because actually that has been a little bit contested because in a sense that, for example, in Germany, yes, men are more likely to vote for populist right, but you have like 40% of general populist right voters who are women. So that's a lot. How do you explain that? And that's because women find this populist right response of family as a source of security as something that also makes them more secure in financial terms, because they are more likely to experience financial insecurity when they vote for total populist voting, as I was showing. So women can also actually be lured into populist right framings, although they're also likely to go for populist left sometimes. So they're actually looking for responses on their insecurity, especially their financial insecurity, because that seems to be really the thing that is associated with their populist support.
Questions? Any questions from students so far?
Thank you so much for the speech. This is a really fascinating book. Yeah. I have the honor to read it from the press.
Really?
Yeah,
because you work with Chris.
Yes. So I highly recommend it to everyone. I have a question related to, because when I read the book, and also I was supervising this module as well, so I got this feedback from some students. They say, you have this, cultural script is a really important concept in your book and also in your teaching, and the resonance as well. So it's like there is a provider of those cultural scripts and also receiver of those cultural scripts, and also the receiver of those cultural scripts, they think they are being recognized, they are being seen. I wonder, within this mechanism of resonance, are there possibly other ways to show the political consequences? For example, in other contexts, there's like no political voting, like here in Europe, even though people did experience insecurity within a similar level, but are there other ways to think about or bring in political consequences in this framework?
Yeah, I think that was something that I was trying to reason for the last chapter in terms of the potential response, because what I'm saying also to address Ned's earlier question is we are in the situation that more groups are potentially affected by saying similar issues. So potentially we could actually make them more resonating with collective solutions. But that is hard to do when you have media that even in music lyrics reproduce a meritocratic language, because we know from cultural sociologists that even pop lyrics are reproducing the meritocratic and producer script. So I think that can only happen if we really have a really careful thinking about the political scripts that parties are producing. So unless, let's say, the mainstream parties, especially the center-left, really engages with these ideas of changing the political script, I really don't see how that can happen, because those scripts are everywhere in society. And therefore, it's really like a major, sort of almost cultural campaign that you have to do, in addition to policies, to address that.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
You spoke earlier in answer to a question about how you don't see this experience of insecurity as leading to a new class. Do you think you could expand on that?
Yeah, sure. I think that is a response to the guy standing precariat. You were in three class, right? So
also,
yeah.
guy standing was here last week, and I went to his talk.
Was it?
Yeah,
I didn't know, because he was. I would have conducted, because he wrote a sort of an endorsement of the book, but saying that insecurity is not precarious. But if you look at the items, they're very similar. Anyway, yeah. So So in order for this to be a class, there should be more of aggregators, collective aggregators like unions. So we don't have any more collective aggregators, and there'll be political scientists that I quote in my book that have done research on that. They can actually channel this into a conscious class, but it's also so much a cross-class issue, and that is the point. I don't want to argue, like Standing does, that this is creating like a unified class. I really don't believe so, because people have different resources to navigate insecurity, and that also reproduces inequality. So the resources you have to navigate insecurity are really strong reproductive of inequality. So I think that really prevents us from getting into a situation where we have a single class, and that is fine. What you need to do is having more like cross-class coalitions or discussions, but still to retain an understanding that there is a deep inequality in navigating insecurity. That I believe, yeah.
Questions? Yeah.
I was wondering if you could expand a bit more on the sources of economic insecurity that you speak of in the book, because I feel like a lot of the research on populism focuses first on the financial crisis, but the past years have shown more and more instances of inflation shocks, especially right now, given the war in Iran. And I was wondering if you could especially expand on the role of inflation as an everyday insecurity in price increases.
Inflation. Yeah, I mean, I think that is something that we capture with the inability of covering for unexpected expenses, for example, which is different than being able to cover for the necessary expenses. But I think another strand of literature you see in coming up in Europe is the role of financialization and the use of credit. And scholars that investigate financialization in Europe write that they cannot really explain that with the welfare regimes, because Europe has more secure welfare regimes. So my point is, no, it's the welfare regimes have become more insecure, and that's why you see more people actually relying on credit here. So I think those are probably some of the main kind of manifestations of what you were asking.
We have time for one more question, if there's any.
Okay, great. So it brings me first to thank Margarita and Ned, our discussants, for providing such insightful comments and questions. And I'm sure there's going to be a longer discussion between the three of you afterwards. And of course, to thank Lorenza for launching her book here with us. It was really wonderful to learn about your work more and be able to clarify some of these points. So thank you all very much. And thank you for attending.